The moment Tehran started putting a price on passage through Hormuz, this war crossed into something uglier than disruption. Iran was not just threatening the world's most sensitive energy corridor, it was testing whether fear around that corridor could be sold back to the world as safe passage. Strip away the diplomatic language, and the shape of the story gets much darker. Ships, routing patterns, and formal communications were already pointing to something that looked less like open navigation, and more like a toll booth. Not a dramatic total closure everyone can rally against, but a filtered corridor where movement starts, depending on permission. Then comes the detail that makes the whole thing feel criminally real. Approved vessels reportedly receive a code and an IRGC escort, which means transit is no longer just about timing or seaworthiness. It means a war zone may already be producing its own approval list. If you want the part of geopolitics that bites before it explains, subscribe now. Then drop one line in the comments if ships need a code and an escort to cross Hormuz. Is that still navigation or is that rent? This works because Hormuz is not just important. It is physically savage. In a corridor where the warning time for an attack can be mere seconds, panic moves faster than any navy, and once fear becomes credible, you do not need to sink every ship to control the water. And beneath every map and price chart is the human reality this system is built on. Since the 28th of February 2026, 21 attacks on commercial ships have been confirmed, 10 seafarers have been killed, and around 20,000 civilians remain aboard vessels in the Persian Gulf. A corridor this dangerous does not have to close completely to become coercive. It only has to make normal movement feel like a gamble. That is why the title matters more than it sounds. The seven-figure number is the bait, but the real terror is the mechanism behind it. A missile strike is a warning. A paid corridor is a method. And the method is what the audience came here for, not can Iran threaten Hormuz. Everyone already knew that. The real click question is whether Tehran has found a way to turn temporary wartime danger into a working pay-to-pass system that the world may despise and still quietly obey. By the time a draft law was being prepared to formalize Iranian supervision over the strait, traffic in the waterway had already effectively come to a standstill. That order of events tells you everything. Pressure came first, paralysis came second, and formal oversight started moving in behind them. That is not how a symbolic threat behaves. That is how a system behaves. First, you make the route dangerous enough that the normal market freezes. Then you create exceptions. And then you make those exceptions look administrative rather than coercive. A total blockade would be loud and simple. This is colder than that. This is what happens when a choke point stops behaving like a public route and starts behaving like a checkpoint with a pricing logic. Then came the giveaway that blows up the lazy open versus closed framing. Iran authorized the passage of vessels carrying essential goods to its own ports through the Strait of Hormuz. That means access is already being filtered through coordination, protocols, and political discretion rather than restored as a neutral right. Once selective access exists, the story mutates. The power is no longer in stopping every ship. The power is in proving that safe movement depends on someone's approval. That is what pay-to-pass actually means here. It does not just mean a ship pays a fee and moves on. It means uncertainty itself gets converted into leverage, and leverage gets converted into a sorting system. Some operators will decide to wait. Some will try to use diplomacy. Some will push for special treatment. Some will calculate that a massive fee is still cheaper than idling cargo, burning insurance, and bleeding time outside a war-shaken bottleneck. The gate does not need every ship to pay. It only needs enough actors to adapt around its existence. Now we get to the number that makes the whole thing feel brutally concrete. At least one ship is reported to have paid us 2 million in Chinese yuan for safe passage. Even if that is not yet the universal tariff, the strategic damage is already done, because the first reported payment proves the concept may already be live. That single payment matters more than an entire week of speeches. It says access to one of the world's most critical maritime corridors may no longer be governed only by law, seamanship, and escort capacity. It may now be governed by who can turn danger into a transaction. And once one ship pays, Every other ship owner has to run the same ugly equation. What costs more? Delay, diversion, insurance, dead time, political risk, or the price of being allowed through. That is how a crisis stops being a headline and starts becoming a business model. This is exactly where mainstream coverage often softens the blow. It treats the fee like a sensational number floating on top of the story. But the number is not the story. The number is the receipt. The story is that a receipt may now exist at all. Hormuz is different because the world cannot casually route around it. This single corridor carries 20% of all internationally traded oil, 34% of seaborne oil trade flows, and 30% of liquefied natural gas exports. When the passage point that Central starts behaving as if access can be filtered, the pressure does not stay on tankers. It radiates outward into energy, freight, inflation, and political stability. That is why the title's promise is bigger than maritime drama. The audience is clicking because they intuitively feel that if the passage through Hormuz starts carrying a seven-figure coercion premium, then the pain will not end at the coastline. It will show up in fuel, supply chains, and every government suddenly pretending the market is an act of nature instead of a response to power. And this is the part that should hit hardest. You do not need a formal empire to tax movement. You need a narrow corridor, a credible danger, enough patience, and a world desperate enough to keep asking how to get through, instead of how to end the system. That is why Iran's move is strategically more mature than a theatrical closure. A full closure dares the world to respond. A selective corridor dares the world to adjust. Adjustment is much easier to extract than surrender. And once the market adjusts, coercion starts to look like logistics. This is also why outside promises to reopen Hormuz should make you suspicious. In a place described as a kill zone, protecting commercial traffic is not a slogan of problem. It is a geometry problem, a timing problem, and a cost problem all at once, which means condemnation can come fast, while actual reversal comes slow. That gap between rhetoric and reversibility is where the story gets truly dangerous. If Tehran believes other powers can denounce this system faster than they can break it, then every day of selective passage becomes another test of what the global market is willing to normalize in exchange for movement. Not accept, normalize. That distinction matters. States can refuse to bless a new reality and still end up trading through it anyway. Shipping does not wait for legal philosophy to catch up with fear. And once that normalization starts, the language gets slippery. Security coordination, managed transit, approved routing, exceptional wartime procedures. Every one of those phrases helps hide the same core fact. Passage is being politicized. That is why Gulf states are speaking in the hardest terms they can justify. Their position is that Iran has closed the strait, obstructed commercial vessels and oil tankers, and imposed fees on some ships for transit. They have to frame it that way because if this gets downgraded into management, then exporters around the Gulf are effectively being told their economic lifeline now runs through someone else's discretion. This is the information war inside the shipping war. Tehran benefits by describing the system as oversight, security, or sovereign control. Its rivals benefit by describing it as extortion, aggression, and maritime coercion. Both sides gain something from the label they choose. Iran gains ambiguity, legal fog, and bargaining room. Its opponents gain urgency, coalition pressure, and a stronger case that a global norm is under attack. But naming the thing does not change the mechanism. It only changes how long the world hesitates before admitting what it is. And the mechanism is already visible. Dangerous corridor, approved traffic, political screening, reports of large payments, strategic signaling that the arrangement could outlive the immediate phase of fighting that is not random chaos, that is a prototype. On paper, transit passage through an international strait shall not be impeded. That is the legal spine of the old maritime order. But ships do not move on paper. They move through coastlines, drones, missiles, mines, speed, fear, and the practical question of who can punish them before anybody can protect them. That legal line still matters because it tells you what the world is supposed to defend, But the problem in Hormuz is that Tehran may be testing how far reality can drift from the norm while just enough legal language remains in play to slow any unified response. That is how coercion hides in bureaucracy. It does not always announce itself by screaming, "Pay us or die." Sometimes it arrives disguised as process. Submit the details, take the route, await the code, coordinate the transit, accept the escort, settle the problem quietly. And once the problem is settled quietly, the precedent gets stronger. Not because everybody believes it is lawful, but because enough actors decide they need movement more than they need clarity. That is how global rules rot, not all at once, but one workaround at a time. This may be the deepest point in the entire story. Iran appears to be thinking about the strait not as a tool to end the war, but as a fixture for the aftermath. If that is true, then this is not a temporary tantrum designed to win a ceasefire. Concession. It is an attempt to carry wartime leverage into the post-war order and make the world negotiate around it. That would explain why the whole pattern feels more deliberate than emotional. Tehran may have concluded that one form of deterrence was degraded, so it is reaching for another. If missile force alone no longer guarantees caution, then control over timing, access, and market pain might. This is the layer the audience clicked for, even if they did not phrase it that cleanly. They are not here only to hear that ships are threatened. They are here to know whether Iran is just plashing out, or whether it is building something durable enough to survive the smoke. The evidence does not prove a fully finished toll regime with every price and every rule neatly settled, but it absolutely does suggest the emergence of a dangerous operating model to make passage hazardous, create selective exceptions, attach value to safe transit, and let the world discover that reopening a choke point on your terms can be more powerful than closing it outright. And that is the real psychological violence of this title. The seven-figure fee is shocking, but the deeper blow is this. The fee may be less important than the permission. Once permission becomes the thing being sold, the old idea of neutral passage is already bleeding. This is why the could in the title matters, and it is also why the answer is harder than a simple yes or no. If the highest-end fee claims harden into routine practice, then Hormuz becomes a priced gateway at the center of the global energy map. If the exact figures later turn out to be lower, narrower, or less standardized, the deeper conclusion still holds. Tehran may already have proved that it does not need a total closure to behave like a gatekeeper. That is the part no surface debunking can erase. You could cut the number and still keep the structure. You could dispute one payment and still be left with selective passage, coded approvals, escorted transits, frozen traffic, and a market forced to adapt around coercion. The strategic transformation survives even if one detail gets revised. And once that transformation is visible, the future gets darker fast. Because if a state under pressure can turn one of the world's most important corridors into a place where safety is rationed, movement is screened, and passage may be monetized, then the global commons have not just been threatened, they have been taught a new price. Come back to the trap cruise for a second, because that is where abstractions go to die. Before presidents can spin this, before traders can price it, before diplomats can rename it, there are civilians sitting on vessels inside a corridor where movement now looks less like a right and more like a favor. They are the first people forced to live inside the future this story is warning about. So yes, seven-figure transit fees could turn Hormuz into Iran's pay-to-pass choke point, not because every last rule is finalized, but because the essential machinery is already visible. The strait does not have to be fully shut for Tehran to dominate outcomes. It only has to become dangerous enough that access itself can be sold back to the world. And if that happens, the biggest danger is not that Hormuz closes. The biggest danger is that closure was only the opening move, and permission was the real product all along. Stay close. This channel tracks the moment coercion stops looking like chaos and starts charging admission.